saving bandwidth.
All right. Hey, good day, everyone. Again, my name is Thomas Flitter, engagement lead for GovComms, and want to thank you for joining us for the issue discussion call today. And the topic is budget update process. We've got a lot of good folks here on board, and want to go through really a couple of things in particular. We've got a new amendment that's out, and want to kind of walk through that today. But so again, thank y'all. As we continue to grow, I think the issue discussion calls are very important for us to bring topics up for the community to discuss. I think with today's topic of the budget process, I think we should, we've got a new amendment out there. I think it's going to be really good. I'm really excited. Thank you again for joining us. So our agenda for today, I'd like to just briefly go over our current budget policy. Also, what are some of the issues being discussed out on the forum? We've got, a lot of these updates to budgets for core units being made. And there's been some discussion about some of the budget policy issues and the processes. So we want to go through those. Also, how are some of these issues being addressed? And in particular, we've got the MIP 40 amendment proposal. We've got members from our strategic finance core unit here today. And we just discussed earlier that hopefully they can go through and, give us the highlights of this amendment proposal. They are chock full of new information, a lot of it coming from the issues that are being discussed. And we'll get an opportunity to kind of go through that and look at this amendment proposal. Also, I want to talk about some of the other considerations for improvement. We've got some of the great ideas that have been put forward on the amendment, but also there was a couple of other ideas out there captured from our community members that I would like to highlight as well. And then we'll have an open discussion session here at the end, just to sort of wrap up any ideas, any other additional feedback about the topic. But ideally, the intent for today's call is really to encourage feedback, to encourage idea generation, for everyone on board to be able to talk about their thoughts and ideas about budget policy and the amendment information that was just recently put out there on the forum, which in the call notes, you also see a link for that. So want to go ahead and talk first, though, about our current budget policy. But before I go any further, is everybody able to see my screen and hear me clearly? And is everybody doing well today? Okay, good, excellent. All right. Well, with that said, we'll talk about our current budget policy. So in the MIP 40, budgets have a framework, and those frameworks are really used to fund the work defined by the core units. The facilitators of the core units, they are the ones that administer the core unit budgets. And within the composition of a budget, it can have multiple entries. It includes both a breakdown and implementation. And also that is interesting because having multiple entries, each of those has an implementation and a breakdown, and enables more advanced compensation and funding structures to be created if so desired. Once the budget's approved, though, the core unit facilitators begin drawing the payments to fund their core unit according to their budget implementation. And in the budget breakdown, the core units, and I do quote this copy, is a best guess breakdown of spending for their core unit during the budget period. The budget breakdown component is non-binding, but it's intended to encourage transparency. In implementation, it defines how and when the core unit facilitators will receive funds that make up their budget. And unlike the breakdown, the implementation is binding. So when those budgets are approved, they also have to be modified. And that portion of adding a modifying budget process can get a little tricky because the core units have their ongoing cost. And if they want to grow, expand, they also have to include that information as well. In that additional modifying those budgets too, excuse me, there's a template that to be followed. And that in that template is where they explain what's needed and what needs to be added. So in essence, that process too has a feedback period of 1 month with a minimum frozen period of 1 week. So essentially, the portions of the budget too include implementation details, which look at smart contracts authorized by Maker governance to draw funds from the protocol. A lot of the things that are within the current MIP 40 budget are, as I believe a couple of core units and some of the forum information was out there, is that we've outgrown it, that there are concerns that, there are certain aspects of it that we need to take a look at so we can improve it. And when we take a look at what are some of the concerns, or at least the recent policy issues that are being discussed out of the forum, these questions have been asked. In particular, the overwhelming budget review process. How can we improve that? In fact, in one of the, I think it was Dunam, who actually spoke from a delegate perspective, said, how do we handle all the budget reviews? There's so many out there. It'd be very overwhelming. Another question was asked, is there a best practice for expanding a budget? When you look at putting together a budget and you want to increase it because a core unit wants to grow or has a growth strategy, many of the components of that are put out there on the forum, and the community will ask, and there will be a lot of time spent actually trying to explain why that budget has to be expanded. Another question that has been posed is, how can expense reporting be less fragmented? How could it be more standardized? And that's, I think, one of the key aspects of the MIP amendment, the new proposal. Also, one thing that came up what I thought was interesting is, should MakerDAO tie in performance and accountability in the budget update? How would that tie in is if we've got OKRs and we've got these things that we are putting together as strategic objectives for a particular core unit, how do those tie in to a budget update? So I hope you've seen some of the questions that have been out there, and I'll try to put those together. Are there any other concerns or questions that folks can or would like to bring up as well? These are some of the ones I tried to tie in, but I wanted to get some feedback from folks on the call here. Any other thoughts about some of the recent issues that are being discussed? Okay. Well, yes, let's see, Peyton said, one additional challenge, we want this to work now as well as in the future when we maybe have 100 core units. It's a very good point. Yeah, absolutely. So any other thoughts or questions? Okay. So I want to lead this into allowing some time for having strategic finance come in and really kind of take a look at. They issued a draft proposal, I believe it was on March 27th, and that the MIP 40 amendment is broken down into several of the sections. If you look at MIP 40, it's, I believe, 4 sections. So I wanted to see if, and thank you for that. Sorry, keep the barrier to entry low. All right, very good. But I wanted to see if someone from AES or anyone from strategic finance would be able to kind of go through what some of the draft proposal amendment is.
Sure. So strategic finance, I think, is on this call. We have, I think I saw Mark's name in the participants. I'm Adrian. We had a chat earlier ahead of the MIP being published, and we have some pages also that we shared with Artem. I don't know if you want to quickly put them on the screen, just to introduce a little bit the context, go quickly through the way that we maybe try and explain the way that we've thought about this MIP process, and then open the floor for questions.
Okay.
Because I think that's where we should probably spend most of our time, just addressing questions.
And yes, if you have a link, then I'll put it up on the screen.
Mm-hmm. Wait, maybe I can just send it to you on Discord, Thomas.
Okay.
Sorry, I shared it with
That's fine.
I put it up in the Zoom chat.
All right, thank you. All right, are you able to see that?
Yeah.
All right, thank you, David.
Yes, so Adrian's pulling up slides specific to this topic, not just the MIP. The MIP's a little heavy to go through line by line.
Okay.
So I think he's sending that over right now.
All right.
And sorry, I shared them with Artem. Maybe Artem, you want to share your screen?
All right. Hold on 1 second. I will.
Yeah, 1 second.
I see. All right. Thank you. And there we are. Very good.
Yep.
I hope you're able to see that then.
Yep. So if you flick to the next page, we're not going to dwell too long on this. Basically, just to remind everyone a little bit of the context, this was triggered by an analysis of the sensitivity of the protocol to various different macro scenarios of varying degrees of likelihood. And here, the conclusion, and this ties into some of the other adjacent concerns that we've highlighted, namely the cognitive overload for delegates and for maker holders to process all of these budget requests, tied to the sensitivity of the protocol itself to macro scenarios, begged for a new type of budget request process that could take these concerns into account and build a more resilient protocol and produce budget requests that were easier to digest and maybe organized in a slightly different timings. If on the next slide, yeah, we talked about how the key risks for Maker were basically either insolvency, which has happened once and probably will not happen one more time, or will happen one more time for the last time, or flippening, which in the flip scenario of a super bullish market, if we are in an environment where we don't invest enough in growth and we fall behind, then we lose our incumbency status, and this is a big deal for the long-term profitability of the protocol. So what we said at the last GNR call was that we would have the discussion, get some preliminary ideas, and submit a draft proposal for further discussion, which is the point where we are. So if you flip to the next page. So here we basically wanted to go over main changes and rationale and explain how we thought about the MIP40 process. So I think IceCube illustrates it in a more, he has this very concise way of speaking, which I think speaks to the way that we want facilitators to think about their budgets. Fundamentally, a core unit budget should serve to grow revenues or improve the operations of the protocol. There are one or two things, at least one of these two things. If you switch over to the next page. Here, we're outlining some of the main changes and some of the main changes that we're proposing in the context of this new process. The first one and most important one is to ask facilitators who are requesting a budget request to tie their core unit budget more closely to the overall objectives of the DAO. And here we're framing it as token holder primacy, and then everything else will follow. I think this is something that facilitators were already doing because it was implied. And in the new budget request proposal, there is an ask for facilitators to make this explicit so that we can shortcut. Often you see in some of the budget requests, you see questions about like, how does this benefit the proposal? Like, what's the point of this line item? How are you thinking about this? Do we really need a X core unit? If we clarify that the core unit budget serves the objectives of the DAO upfront, you remove a lot of the cognitive overhead, both for the facilitator at the time of developing the budget and for the token holders at the time of evaluating. Similarly, here the aim is to simplify the decision-making process. We're aiming to provide a framework where nothing is implied and everything is explicit. So facilitators have the opportunity to question themselves at the moment of producing the budget, whether it adds value to the protocol or not. And maker holders have the ability to evaluate, analyze, and compare whether this budget helps increase the token value for them. Deeply regret missing the parentheses at the end of this bullet point. I'll fix it. I'll fix the typo afterwards. And then the final point is one of our main motivators was to improve transparency and accountability for core unit operations on an ongoing basis. So one aim here is to provide a recommendation for the way that the core unit budget proposals are structured, so that it's clear and transparent for token holders to evaluate where the commitments are to spending these operating expenses, and for 12 months afterwards, compare and contrast and review whether they actually spent where they said they were going to spend. There is some of this already in place, but we're proposing, particularly in the expenses side, we'll be proposing more detailed charts of accounts that can help on this transparency without, for that, meaning that it's a huge amount of extra work for the facilitators either. On the next page. So here, I'm not going to read this out loud. This is basically what we tried to summarize as some of the FAQs from the thread. The high frequency trading core unit is not real yet. It was just an example that we thought would be useful so that people could see what the implications of this budget proposal were. There was a question on what we would do if the core unit fails to return funds. So there's an element of fund return at the end of the 3 month budget window. And here, the only thing that we can reasonably do as a core unit in this decentralized sort of governance structure is basically flag it and the expense reports that we publish on a regular basis, and then let the community decide. So this should leave it open. So if, for example, there is a bullet payment in the 4th or 5th month that requires the budget to remain in the wallet, this is a perfectly good explanation, and it's just a matter of being upfront with the community in our view. Are we adding a lot of work to facilitators? And I think this relates also slightly to a question Walter had about how we keep the barrier to entry low to the DAO. So just to paraphrase his question, how can we keep the DAO open for new participants? So indirectly, how does this budget proposal make it easier for facilitators? The answer to this is that being transparent and being upfront about how a core unit budget is adding value to the protocol is a key prerequisite, without which it doesn't really make sense for a new facilitator to join. So facilitating a core unit is, the barrier to entry should be low, but it should also be clear that facilitating a core unit is like running and owning a business. So these are fairly basic questions that a facilitator is being asked, and we're happy to help any prospective facilitators answer them, because we understand that there's an element here of, it might be helpful to go back and forth, and this is definitely within the mandate of the strategic finance team to exchange on potential budget requests to help fine-tune them and identify the sources of value and frame them in the right way. But if these questions, prospective facilitator is unable to answer them, then it's a perfectly fair question to ask whether this mandate would be better fulfilled by an existing team or through a grants program or otherwise. There was a question, I think, from Elpro on how to combat lowballing and overestimating budgets. And here, I think I want to come back a little bit to speaking about how budgets should be serving the objectives of the DAO and driving value for token holders. Because if you measure it by that metric, then this concern melts. And as long as token holders are engaged and voting for the benefit of the DAO and for the protocol. If you commit to returns and accountability, then the size of the request doesn't actually matter. What actually matters is whether that capital is being put to its best possible use. In other words, if you ask for a large budget, the return, that's fine, but the return hurdle will be higher. So the onus is on the facilitator to create a plan, propose a plan, and be accountable to a plan that can deliver the necessary return. If the expectations on the other side are lowballed, then it should be clear from the proposal that the money would be better spent elsewhere, maybe in another core unit or maybe in an investment. If you think of it as, do we add another engineer? Do we buy back tokens? Do we, invest them in ETH, or do we invest in a lowball core unit budget? If you measure it in terms of the token holder value, then these concerns should dissipate. So yeah, basically tying return expectations to a budget and keeping facilitators accountable to those is key to making this MIP process work. And this is something that we feel was implied until now. I think facilitators have always had the intention of delivering value to the protocol, but often what happened is that by not making the direct return of a budget clear to token holders, all that does is just create a lot of discussion that doesn't necessarily need to happen. So what we're aiming to do here is just provide a framework for all of the information that we believe is already there, just to organize in a way that's more easily digestible for token holders. And then someone asked about pay for performance, which is tied, similar to this idea of investing in putting capital in its best possible use. It's a great idea, but we're not going to wade into it in this MIP. And we'll potentially, exchange some ideas about a new MIP to make a larger pay for performance component. So yeah, sorry, I don't want to take over too much time. If you flip to the next slide, I think we go straight into. So on the next slide, I think the only thing that's left is a sort of diff, where we've taken the existing MIP 40 and the new MIP 40, and we have an overview of the rationale and benefits. We're not going to go through all of it. Instead, I propose that we open the floor to questions. And if a question pertains to a specific paragraph or section of the MIP, that we jump to that slide, to that relevant slide. Yeah, so this is what the remaining slides look like. It's just like 6 or 7 pages of this. And here I propose to open the floor to questions, to raising the hands and that sort of thing. And then we can jump straight to the section that's concerned.
Thank you for that. That was great. Anybody have questions, comments, thoughts?
I guess my question is, I think one of the goals with doing the budget amendment was to make it scalable, right? And like not as onerous to review. But it sounds like this framework basically just adds a whole new layer of analysis, basically around the performance aspect of core units. Do you think that this is sort of a necessary component? Or if it's already kind of implied, like, does it need to be sort of explicitly a part of a budget? Yeah, or does it just add a lot of extra work on top that doesn't really equate to a lot of value?
No, fair enough. So I think here it's worth skipping to, so if you skip page, Thomas, next page, one more time. One more time. Here, yes. So okay, there are two elements to this question that I'd like to address. The first one is the cognitive overhead of processing these budget requests. In order to tackle this, what we've done is introduce this concept of a submission period, so that we concentrate all of the budget proposals into quarterly windows. I think part of the problem is that with this monthly governance cycle, there's a tendency for budget requests to spring up haphazardly, and it makes it difficult to evaluate, particularly in the context of other important governance issues that might be required. Forcing these requests into these windows also forces the facilitators to take a longer-term view for the planning of their activities, and we think that this is a good thing. The facilitators are taking on responsibility on behalf of the token holders to absorb investment and to conduct activities that add value to the protocol. And part of this responsibility involves a high degree of long-term planning, hence the maker vesting, which is part of the core unit compensation. So yeah, we don't think that it's necessarily a large overhead to ask people to stick to specific submission windows, because here the biggest benefit is for the people who are being asked to evaluate them. The other thing regarding Windows ID. So I think that basically that's 80% of the. I think hopefully this addresses 80% of your question. And then the other part is the fact that yes, there's a whole element of sort of performance analysis. The problem today is that this element is implied. Every time you have a framework or a structure that's implied, it makes things worse, because then you have to spend time explaining the rationale when it should be clear up front. By asking facilitators to do the work, it doesn't necessarily mean more work. It just means organized in a structured manner that allows maker holders to evaluate them more efficiently. In principle, should actually reduce the amount of time that people spend on this, both to create and to evaluate. I hope this answers your concerns.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on to that, these questions, while more comprehensive than the existing MIP process, are really questions that any business owner should be able to answer quite easily. It shouldn't take you really long to think about the value that you're creating leading a team. And these are all questions that are routinely asked in corporate business world. So if someone thinks there's a certain question or area that's unclear, and we're happy to talk through, with any prospective facilitators, or if they're having trouble doing variance analysis or understanding, what changes in this MIP, we're more than happy to help facilitate that process and try and provide some more detail on the reasonings and how you could answer these questions.
All right, thank you very much. I think we've got a couple more questions in line. Got some hands raised here. Peyton, I think you had your hand raised, and
Wouter can go first.
Okay, go ahead, Wouter.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, first of all, I want to say that I really like the proposal that is made. So I think it's very on point when it comes to the identifying the missing structure in the existing MIP 40. So, and I agree with the point that providing the structure might make it easier actually for facilitators to present the budget that they want to request. So yeah, the thoughts I have are more in the periphery and are typically like about the next step and things like that. And I have a lot more that that we can discuss later on. But there's one thing I did want to comment on at this point, which is the submission windows are my least favorite element of the proposal. And the reason is that I guess there are two reasons. One is I don't see how it would make the life of facilitators easier having a barrage of budget requests at one point. So it might actually be easier for them to do a few budget requests every month rather than having them all at once at the end. I don't know, did I say facilitator? I meant delegates, yes.
Yep.
So that's actually, and we already see this with, and this is just the monthly cycle. There is a big variation in the workload when suddenly everyone is submitting their proposal, and then yeah, you have to process that all at once. The one advantage that I see with grouping them together is that it may be easier to pick priorities. Like if there are 3 different budget proposals, they need to be compatible with each other when there is a budget cap and things like that. So that might help with it. But the budget windows, overall, I think they might actually create this choking point for the workload of delegates. And I also do think of all the elements that were included, this is probably the most restricting element for facilitators. So for example, if they just missed their deadline, having to wait another 3 months is yeah, that is difficult sometimes, I think. So it might have unintended consequences. The other thing I wanted to add to this is that, so while I agree that we need to structure the information in a way that is as easy as possible for delegates to process, as we are scaling up, we will need to tackle that issue in any case in more structural ways. And there is another element that plays here, which is not just bandwidth in terms of number of hours, but the available expertise, right? And this is in general, I think, a concern that the delegates might not always be very well equipped to make good calls on specific budget line items. And this, I think, it's nothing against this proposal, but this is a risk that we need to be mindful of. If we create too simple, like if it's like a list of line items that the delegate goes through and they go, well, do we really need this one and do we really need that one? It is important that we preserve enough independence of the core units to determine within their area of expertise what the necessary expenses are. What you sometimes bump into is the problem where, for example, yeah, if engineering proposes a budget and then there's a high cost in security, that there is like specific commentary on that line item, and that we are basically driven towards cost cutting in areas where we really shouldn't cut the costs. So delegates are restricted in 2 ways: number of hours and expertise. And I think while we should try and structure the information in a way that alleviates that as much as possible, we will need additional mechanisms anyway to address that. So yeah, those were my first points.
No, thanks, Wouter. I think some valid concerns. I think Paper mentioned in the chat one reasoning why I think delegates might welcome a submission window, basically, which is basically to treat budget requests in a consistent way, as they might change from month to month. And related to this, Peyton had a question: what happens if you need to request ad hoc funding between the cycles? I think this may well occur. This may well happen for sure. I think this is more a question of on the planning side. Oh yeah, I'll jump to the question. So it's more on the planning side. It's up to the facilitator to make sure that the plans are executed, or that the plans are done within the time frame of the budget term. So these budgets, they're set for a time period between 3 to 12 months, and there are enough submission windows that it should allow core unit facilitators to make modifications along the way, provided that they do the job correctly upfront. And we're trying to basically backload more of the planning work. And in the ideal, we would have fewer new budget requests, short of like a major change in the macro environment. I think for Walter's point regarding how to explain the different line items, I think the intention is not necessarily to get into the weeds unless the delegate necessarily wants to. But I think the framework that we're proposing should help the facilitators explain the line items as well. Because if you switch back to page 4, I think. 9. If you go back. One more. 2 more. Yeah, okay, sorry, I missed it. Well, no, this one is good as well, actually. But yeah, it's Ice Cube saying the expense should help grow revenues or improve operations. And in the case of your example with the security budget, it's clear that it improves operations. And people might balk at the size, but then the facilitator has the opportunity to show, no, actually you need to invest these DAI here because you'll improve the operations by making it more secure and avoiding a 20 million DAI loss in some other area.
Yeah, just to add to the budget window question, it's certainly something we're open to receiving feedback on. I guess it was designed with the delegates in mind and conversations we'd have with delegates regarding cognitive overhead, having new budgets pop up constantly. And this also ties significantly into how we financially plan as a DAO. If you have different periods of budgeting and things changing constantly, it's very difficult to plan a long-term financial strategy, and especially for allocating capital. So one of the benefits of planning these in specific periods is we have a much better sense of what our holistic expenses are as a DAO and how we can allocate capital more effectively. So I'm seeing some questions about what happens if a CU misses its budget window, but is mission critical, or if there's an unplanned event. So regarding unplanned events, I guess most core units have a contingency buffer that should be sufficient to handle most unplanned events. If there's something in excess of that, or if there's a situation where core unit misses a budget window, we could certainly add a modification for an emergency proposal, essentially, to ensure that those are funded. But I think we could certainly account for that and manage that.
I mean, today budgets are already essentially padded, right? They all come with a certain amount in contingency buffer, which is for contingencies.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Peyton, you had your hand up.
Yeah. So obviously I had a few questions in chat there. I think they've mostly been addressed. I guess I'll start coming from the facilitator's perspective. Like, for instance, one of the things that gave us confidence to submit like a year-long budget is this fact that we can always submit a budget again if there's something major we need to pivot to. And I think the really strict budget windows, especially for only twice annually for a CU, kind of underestimates how quickly the space can evolve, right? How quickly things can change, and yeah, so that is one part, I guess, coming from a CU perspective, I think might be worth looking into. But at the same time, I can see why it makes it easier both for delegates, both for financial planning, and you know, you have to balance those trade-offs. So I guess the crutch of my question that I'd like to ask kind of comes from a meeting I had with Tadeo the other day. So shouting you out to give you credit there. But he raised the point that the more regulations, the more restrictions we add to something that must be done for it to be considered a legitimate budget, like the larger we're going to have to make every team that applies as a CU, right? Because currently core units are our only real way to reliably distribute funds, and perhaps we need to work on having other ways. But an unintended effect of this could be basically a bloating of core units anytime they come to apply, because no longer will be financially feasible to have a unit of 2 or 3 people if one person is essentially going to be kind of wrapping around all these different budget requirements, both before they submit, during, and afterwards. So my question there is, like, what can be done to make sure that we can still have nimble core units that don't have to add a bunch of personnel, since those tend to be the largest expense that we're seeing as a DAO.
Yeah, I think that's.
Can I add
I don't know.
my comment
Yeah, I think
first?
I think
Because it's
Walter had
related.
a. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and yeah, I want to just second that this. So the idea that I asked in chat, like, how can we keep the barrier to entry low? And so I think we do need to recognize that the DAO, if it is going to work well and efficiently, and it needs to play on its strengths, right? And one of these strengths is openness. And I think also the opportunity for people to learn and potentially fail. And as Peyton was saying, to keep things nimble. And, you know, this doesn't go against this proposal per se, but what it indicates, I think, is that as Peyton mentioned, we may need additional structures to kind of ease the slope here, right? So grants were mentioned. The issue with grants is that they are a whole lot less structured. So ideally, I would like us to think like one step further and ask ourselves, like, how can we create an environment where beginning teams, they have this room to grow and become better. Maybe one part of the answer might be to add some expectations around the finality of the budget. So for example, if you have a new team, maybe the budget isn't that that's like strongly thought through as like a very experienced team. But maybe we can have some kind of trial period where they go ahead, but then at the same time there is the understanding that their budget allocation is less final than one that so it might be more easily withdrawn again. So this is it's kind of a grant, but it's more structured. So it helps to like ladder up, right? And in the same regard, so the other question is like, what is optional, what is mandatory? One very simple thing that I think we can do is to add some defaults to the sections that were added. So for example, winding down a core unit, I think we might define like a default procedure that applies in 80% of the cases. So that reduces maybe the significant hurdle that new facilitators might face to, you know, they don't know the DAO environment. They may need help. As you mentioned, you were willing to provide that help, but simply having a default might already help to reduce the barrier to entry there. So yes, similar sentiments.
So here, I think this is so I think I want to countenance. So I want to counteract one maybe perception that reducing core unit budget performance evaluation to token holder value, growing revenues, and improving operations somehow raises the risk or makes it impossible for someone to try and fail and try again. What you described as the ability to fail, and which is very nicely put, and it's something that we, I think, like a lot, particularly in this space, early as it is. The ability to fail is actually helped with this structure and would be undermined by introducing more complexity. So let me explain this. If you take, for example, if you compared an experienced operator who is submitting a budget proposal versus an inexperienced facilitator who's putting together a budget proposal, I think necessarily the delegates would evaluate them while taking that into account, and they would recognize that just for having attempted something and maybe having failed in the outcome of the mandate, there's a learning process there that makes it more likely for the following budget to succeed. And if you frame it in the context of grow revenues and improve operations, and in general increasing token holder value, it should be possible for an ambitious, high energy, driven, inexperienced potential facilitator to put together a budget that could conceivably not achieve its aim, and then submit a new budget proposal that explained how this time it can really work and provide the plan to do so. Because it's all just about putting together plans and executing against them, and then explaining what happened to the plan as it was executed. Our mention of grants or other core units is integrated also into this MIP 40 proposal. And I would be wary of introducing the concept of a shadow budget that could essentially hide operating expenses and shelter them from accountability to the token holder. This MIP 40 proposal basically should stop that from taking place, because grants or an expense in an existing core unit is measured against as well. So if it's increasing the size of the expenses, it should attract accountability to that expense also. So I think the intent here is to keep things really simple. And our role, our mandate as a strategic finance core unit is precisely to help new operators, new facilitators on board. If someone has a good idea, if they think they can put together the high frequency trading core unit, they can add value to Maker, and it's within the objectives of the DAO. But they've never, done a P&L in their lives or anything like it. We'll spend time with them to help them explain it and address it. And should they fail, but they continue to have the same amount of energy for the protocol, the same amount of ambition, and they can demonstrably create a new plan that adapts and learns from their past mistakes, token holders should be able to evaluate these, take them into account, and approve it. Sorry, that was quite a rant, but
yeah, just like to add, I really wanted to draw a distinction between openness and transparency, and this MIP is really about transparency. Given all of the budgeting and activity on the forums continues to ramp up, I think we really need to have some of these baseline questions just answered up front, so delegates don't have to go through every single budget proposal and ask for almost the same questions. Like there's some MIPs that come through with a very structured process, and some that just do something different that's kind of outside the existing kind of standard, I would say. So we really don't think this adds or reduces the openness of the protocol. And I guess when it comes to openness and accessibility, I still think this DAO is, if not the most open and accessible, it's got to be one of the top ones. I mean, you can get involved in a team by volunteering. You can get part-time work. There's full-time opportunities, and for facilitators, you can go through the SES incubation program to kind of get up to speed and understand how we do things here. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys can incubate a team for really as long as it takes until you believe they're ready to launch their own core unit. And then as has already been covered, there's the grants program for kind of, ad hoc specific projects.
Thank you. Thank you all for your comments. We've got a couple more hands that are raised, and I just want to be mindful of time that we've got about 6 minutes left in the session.
We're happy. I'm happy to stay on longer if needed.
Okay.
For what it's worth. I know it's enough. Yeah, there are other meetings as well, but I'm happy to stay here to answer questions.
Okay, that's great. I think who is next in line? Patrick.
Thanks. Yeah, just a couple of fairly small questions, actually. Number one, let's imagine that GovAlpha have submitted a DAI budget and it's been voted down by the delegates. The MIP as it stands, from my reading of it, doesn't actually account for them being able to come back and resubmit, and they would have to wait for the next submission window. So is that something that we're going to look to address, and kind of for these specific situations of where a budget's failed to pass governance? And the second question, which again is one that we've talked about internally, is have you thought about separating the voting for DAI and MKR budgets? Because previously, what tends to happen is a DAI budget and an MKR budget get bundled together as a MIP set under MIP 40. And we were very conscious when we submitted our budgets recently that we put them up separately so that governance could assess both on their merits rather than voting through an MKR budget because they wanted to support our DAI budget.
I think we're hearing a lot of questions around the timings, and here I think Euro Hobson's choice. I think regarding the timings, it's a fair point. I'll be honest. I think
we do have ranked choice voting in here, so there's basically an option to fund an expanded budget, continue funding the existing budget, or reject the budget. So if your budget is flat out rejected, then yes, you'd have to wait for the new submission window. But you would think that for existing core units where the current team is providing value that is meeting the expectations of delegates and maker holders, that at the very least you would see a continuation vote rather than a pure rejection. If there's a pure rejection, I think there's going to be a lot more activity going on and hopefully more clarity in terms of why that specific budget is outright rejected.
And then on Peyton's point, I think we maybe didn't get to this point in his question about the larger CUs. Again, the point is that it's not necessarily about the amount of expense itself, but it's about whether this capital is being put to its best possible use. So if a core unit wants to inflate to account for larger submission windows, so for longer submission windows, for instance, or for whatever reason, then they're going to have to be accountable to the associated increase in results expectations to it, and we believe they should. Maybe if this is really a pressure created by a submission window, I don't know, because I feel like if you submitted a giant budget, if you submitted a mega budget, then you're just going to raise a huge amount of questions about why you need all that cash and whether it's the best possible use of the capital.
And we also had one more hand raised, I believe. Order, did you have a question? Had your hand raised?
Oh no, sorry. No, I was good.
All right.
Yeah, so there was the second part of the question. Thanks, Patrick, between separating Maker, DOT, and DAI budgets. It's something that I think the community has broadly gone back and forth on. And in my mind, I would like to see them separate, but I know, there's some people that feel strongly about having it one way or the other. So it's definitely something we would like community feedback on to see, especially what the delegates and maker holders believe is the appropriate path. Because I think there's, somewhat reasonable arguments on both sides.
All right. Thank you for that. That was really good conversations. Are there any other questions? Everybody in the chat, is everybody able to get their questions addressed? Anything else?
So can you clarify, Peyton? Is in response to something else?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. So basically the point I was trying to get at was that if we require a lot more work like upfront for submitting a budget, and also, you know, like reporting and transparency after it's approved, then all of a sudden you're kind of creating a role that mostly has to focus on that. That is kind of the facilitator role by default. But for smaller core units where the facilitator is trying to wear many hats, that may no longer be viable. Essentially, if we add more regulation on top of what must be contained within certain proposals.
Yeah, so I guess I would say like these questions are really, I think, the bare minimum that any core unit should really be able to answer. And I think most core units are already thinking of these things, answering these questions when they go through the incubation program with SES. So I think it's really about just being forthright and transparent. So delegates don't have to, you know, read through every single proposal really line by line to get the key information they need to make a minimum decision. And honestly, I think, you know, the MIP's a little long, and we're happy to do, you know, educational sessions for how we populate. That's kind of why we did this, you know, example template with the, you know, high frequency trading core unit. But in reality, you know, answering these questions, I think should really not take longer than an hour, like maximum. So if core units aren't thinking of all these things and need some guidance in terms of how they should be asking for more budget in certain areas, if they're looking for a budget investment, you know, we're happy again to have those conversations, but we really don't see this as a lot of, you know, red tape or administrative overhead on the end of the facilitators.
And on a smaller business, sorry to interrupt, just if a core unit is smaller, the justifications will also be lower, right? The business will be less complex. The core unit will be less complex.
Right, but the hours that basically one has to spend maintaining budget requirements go much higher, which means like you're more likely to have to hire an additional hand, and that's going to be the like most expensive part of your budget, right? So
What do you mean by maintaining budget standards?
So for instance, like think about the requests, for instance, that that information is included to how they would cut back their budget or spending within a bear market or some stretch goals that they might achieve. Like a simple question on its face, but when you really think about it, it's like, okay, well, now I have to think about what are the market scenarios that might cause this to happen. How does this affect my core unit particularly? Like, you know, with respect, like I think if you're only spending an hour additional to answer that question, you're probably not answering it very well. And then you have transparency as well as returning requirements, which I'm all for and then very much support. However, like it's basically just adding on tasks. It's adding on things that a core unit has to do in order to be considered eligible. And the more things you add on, the more hands eventually you're going to have to hire to maintain the process.
So here, I think I want to dispel this idea that this MIP is asking for extra work, because what the intention is, that's not at all the intention. The intention is to take work that is already taking place to put together these budget proposals and slide it into a structure that makes it easier to digest. So like for like, a budget request that's been written in the current unstructured way, let's say by someone inexperienced in writing budgets, so they don't necessarily know how to frame it or how to structure it beyond the template that's in the GitHub, and a framework that tells them what to put and where. Ideally, they should be spending less time on it. The task of, and then regarding the task of preparing for a bear market or for a bull market, this I think it's the nature of the beast. We need to be able to adapt to volatile market environments. It's not necessarily something that needs to be maintained or updated or even done in such a detailed way as the core budget. But the maker holders have clearly asked for some explanations in the context of a bear market of what the protocol would do to reduce expenses, and preempting this shows that the core units are ready for any eventuality, rather than letting the protocol fall into losses.
So to add to that, I actually think, and this is what I put in chat, I just want to clarify what I mean by it. I think you have, like, I think maybe there are some things there that could be optional, and like having a default, as I said, might already help. But in general, I do agree that most of these things that are in the proposal should be things that at least the facilitator should have thought about. But like it might actually, because we're creating even this, it could just be the impression that this is worse than what it actually is, right? Like, oh, I will spend a week on it, and they will like interrogate me about every line item of my budget, etc. Part of the answer to keeping the barrier to entry low for the right participants might actually be to frame the communication more in terms of support and helping to structure things, rather than emphasizing too much like the obligations. And this may seem silly, but I think it actually makes a very big difference. When we talk about openness, for example, there's a very different message you're sending when you're telling someone, we will help you to structure a proper budget for your core unit so that you're set up for success, versus saying you should really think about this long list of all the things before you even think about applying, right? And I think it's a point that should not be underestimated. I don't think, I think it actually makes a big difference in practice.
No, that's a very good point, actually, Walter. And it's definitely our intention to. So the way we thought about this was hard requirements and then a lot of support, right? This is well within the mandate of our core unit to help. We have financial backgrounds, each of us. We're familiar with how to put together budgets. We've put together budgets ourselves. So this is definitely something that we can help with people who need it and who ask for it. And it's a very good point taken, and we'll think of a way to frame within the structure of the SMIP the fact that this help is available and that it's not just a sink or swim situation. I mean, it kind of is sink or swim, but we'll help people float. We'll help people swim.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear addressing that. I was on our last slide there was going to say other considerations, and I think we just brought one of them up, which was the consideration of a budget review committee, where you have like the questions we're asking is, how do we find the support for those that do not have a financial background that are responsible for doing these? And so I think that was the last slide before the open discussion, but that was one of the key elements, or at least key suggestions that was out there on the forum talking about a budget review committee.
Yeah, like Ice Cube on this slide is hard, but he's on our side, right? So he's going to help us put together the best budgets.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, this has been quite a great discussion call today. Are there any other questions, or I could just open it up for any other thoughts?
I want to say.
Sorry, David, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was just going to express like a lot of gratitude to the strategic finance guys for putting this together, for thinking through a lot of these things, and for putting forward a proposal. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. And thank you, David. I also want to encourage everyone with these great ideas and thoughts is that what is, Mark, and what was the window for this April 4, I believe it was, or I'm sorry, is that correct? To have some feedback. Don't forget to visit the forum. We've got the link out there to make some comments. But what was the window? Was it April 4 before this goes?
No, I think it's in May, I think, from what I remember.
I was going to say the last edits can go in April 27th if you want to get in for May 4th.
Okay.
Yeah, this was the intention, right? To give enough time for people to submit feedback and to incorporate this feedback before a formal submission.
Great.
But we wanted to put the emphasis on the action and on doing things since our last GNR call. So we didn't want to. Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right, so we do have one more hand raised before we head out. Whatever.
Yeah, two last points. To illustrate what what Peyton is saying, for example, already spent a lot of time working on the budget without considering market conditions and how it relates to like the mandatory or optional nature of this. One default might be to say, well, if it's really like a critical core unit, there really might not be like this might already be minimum viable operations, and these so the two scenarios, the answer might just be like, yeah, if this budget isn't available, then we can't do this. Even just pointing that out is already an improvement upon not just addressing it at all. And so this is one example of how a default could help the facilitators to make things easier. The other point I want to make, there are exceptions sometimes, like for example, the DECO core unit budget is very different in structure than all the other ones. So one question we need to ask is, with this MIP 40 in place, does it mean that this is no longer possible? I think that would be problematic. So we need to think about exceptions too. And this again ties to, is this like the only standard? Is this mandatory for everyone? And is it a hard rule, or is it a little bit more nuanced than that? And yeah, with this, I'll leave it.
I guess the most important hard rule that we wanted to introduce was the concept of serving the token holder, of growing the revenues of the protocol, and of improving the operations, and then everything else should follow. This is the thinking behind this proposal. So yeah, to the extent that DECO might need a different chart of accounts to explain their budget, for example, I don't see why that shouldn't be allowed in this MIP standard. For as one example. But yeah, we need to. I mean, and the point is, facilitators are already thinking about this, right? And facilitators are already putting together their budgets with the view to improve the protocol. Everybody's, we give people the benefit of the doubt. Everybody's doing their best. This structure should help them communicate that clearly and show that how this value is being created for the token holder. And then everything else is more about the implementation and the detail, and then a structure to hopefully alleviate a lot of the work that some people have raised as potential issues. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's great, and thank you for offering offline further discussion. Really want to appreciate it. I really appreciate everybody being here and having a great number of questions and great discussion today. Again, don't forget that. Did you have your hand raised again?
No, sorry, this is just Zoom that doesn't lower my hand when I talk. Sorry.
All right. But again, thank you all for being here today. I'm sure there will be much more conversation about this issue. And thank you all and for joining us here today. And we really appreciate it. Please stay tuned for the next issue discussion call next month. Again, I'm Thomas Flitter, Engagement Lead for Governance Communications. And thank you for all of your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks all.